This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. This might be the best streaming news show hosted by a zero-time award-winning journalist named Christian. I had to get really specific there. Here's what we got for y'all. Tens of millions of Americans have gotten at least one dose of a coronavirus vaccine, but deadlier, more transmissible variants aren't going anywhere. We'll tell you more about how experts say we should be fighting that threat. Plus, climate activists have some new suggestions for the Texas energy system following the statewide crisis that was prompted by extreme weather. But first, here's what you need to know right now. When can kids get a COVID vaccine? The answer depends on vaccine trials currently underway, and Moderna says it just vaccinated the first children in its latest trial. This one focuses on kids older than 6 months and younger than 12 years. More than 6,000 kids will take part. Participants will get their second dose 28 days later. Both Moderna and Pfizer have ongoing trials to test how effective their vaccines are for teens and adolescents. Health experts say older kids may be able to start getting vaccinated before the next school year. Younger kids and babies may not be cleared to get them until the end of 2021 or the start of 2022. Meanwhile, the Biden administration is urging all schools to resume in-person learning as soon as possible. This week, teachers in all 50 states became eligible to get the vaccine. Even as many schools are already in person, the Centers for Disease Control is looking at whether it's safe to put a classroom full of children in the same room. A new study published in Clinical Infectious Diseases suggests that 3 feet of distance may be as safe as 6 feet so long as everyone is masked. The CDC says it's reviewing the findings. At least a dozen countries have stopped using AstraZeneca's COVID vaccine after reports that a small number of vaccine recipients got blood clots or had abnormal bleeding. Keep in mind, this vaccine from AstraZeneca has not been approved for use in the US, but it's still going through tests. Globally, millions have received this vaccine, and there's been only a few reports of these health issues. The head of the European Medicines Agency says they're working to determine if this was a side effect or simply a coincidence. In the meantime,
we are still firmly convinced that the benefits of the AstraZeneca vaccine in preventing COVID-19 with its associated risk of hospitalization and death outweigh the risk of these side effects.
The results from their review are expected Thursday. A World Health Organization advisory committee also met to discuss the AstraZeneca vaccine today. Some experts worry that a pause on administering the shot will contribute to vaccine hesitancy in some countries. 2 men were charged with assaulting Officer Brian Sicknick at the Capitol riots on January 6th. According to court filings, they used a chemical spray to temporarily blind Sicknick and 2 other Capitol police officers. The men face a number of charges, including up to 20 years for assaulting a federal officer with a dangerous weapon. Worth noting, prosecutors did not link the attack to Sicknick's death the following day. Sicknick's cause of death has not been revealed, and autopsy results are still pending. More than 300 people have now been charged in the Capitol riots. Prosecutors expect at least 100 more arrests as the investigation continues to sift through thousands of hours of video documenting the attack. We're making some significant headway in the fight against COVID. More than 70 million folks in the US have gotten at least one dose of a COVID vaccine, and providers are administering almost 2.5 million doses a day. But the threat of coronavirus variants is still very present. A new study shows the coronavirus variant first discovered in the UK is more deadly, and experts have told us the US needs to be doing more to track it and stop the spread. Newsy's Lindsay Thies takes a closer look.
JAMIN STUHR and his friends drove to Florida for spring break, but say they're still keeping the pandemic on their minds.
I get how people can get confused or forget about COVID when you're here, but we just try to remember it and stay safe.
A little bit during the beginning of spring break here, it got a little crazy.
Now the CDC says in states including Florida and California, a quarter of cases are a more contagious variant of the virus, and they expect it to spread.
Our current models still project, but by the end of March, early April, B.1.1.7 will be the dominant variant.
B.1.1.7, the variant first discovered in the UK, is 55% more deadly and spreads faster and more easily.
It's not evenly distributed across the United States. We do have B.1.1.7 reported in 50 jurisdictions, over 4,700 cases reported so far, and that's just based on what we're evaluating and sequencing.
Until we get people vaccinated, we're really in a race between vaccines and variants.
Variants aren't going away. The numbers we're seeing could be much higher, and that has everything to do with something very sciencey and technical, but key to finding and fighting variants: genome sequencing.
You can't get it done at home, you can't get it done at CVS, you can't get it done at your local healthcare provider. It's more the researchers at these larger research institutions can isolate virus from an individual.
So here's the gist with genomic sequencing and variants. There are about 30,000 genetic isolates, or pieces, represented by the grains of white sugar here, that scientists have to go through in one swab of sample in someone's COVID test. And scientists have to go through every single little piece to make sure that there isn't any type of mutation or variant. So those mutations are represented by this very generous teaspoon of brown sugar here. The way that it works, mutations happen all the time and might be a change in about a dozen or so isolates in one sample. But scientists still have to go through and analyze all of those 30,000 little pieces to make sure they've correctly identified or sequenced the variants. And that is very slow and very expensive. The CDC says it takes about 10 days to sequence one sample, meaning when the results come out, a person is past the most infectious stages of disease, limiting public health officials' ability to contain it. The cost of one analysis? From $25 to $400. Ramping up sequencing is happening at both state and local levels, but right now, every state is far below sequencing around 5% of cases, which experts recommend. Only 6 states are sequencing even above 1.7% of cases: Hawaii, Utah, Wyoming, Oregon, Washington, and Maine. Bottom line, even with vaccines, variants will keep cropping up, so it is important to keep following public health guidelines.
We're close, and I think that's what people feel too, you know, but we all got to do our part so we can get to the end.
Lindsay Thies, Newsy, San Francisco.
When we're back, we'll head to a place that gives us everything except what we ask for, an edit button. Can't have a new administration without North Korea popping off, can we? Here's what's trending. It's been a while since we've heard from North Korea, but the reclusive nation just sent the US a reminder that they're still feuding with us. Kim Yo-jong, the sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, reportedly warned the US not to cause a stink by carrying out military exercises on the Korean peninsula. North Korea usually issues similar warnings whenever the US and South Korea put on a show of military cooperation. In this case, Kim's message came just as Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin began a series of meetings with Japan and South Korea. The Biden White House hasn't let on how it plans to respond to North Korea just yet. Okay, write this one down. The island nation of Guam is also an official US territory. Memorize that little factoid and you can avoid having something like this happen to you. US Representative Michael San Nicolas of Guam paid a visit to the office of Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. He brought a box of cookies, some history books, and a whole squad of Guamanian National Guard members. This was in response to Greene's comment at CPAC, where she listed Guam alongside other foreign countries like China and Russia.
Not for what? China, Russia, the Middle East, Guam, whatever.
Unfortunately, Greene happened to be out of her office during the cookie delivery. She later accused Democrats on Twitter of using the National Guard for a political stunt. Elliot Page is ready for this moment, at least according to the new Time cover story of the actor. The Time cover marked Page's first big interview since coming out as transgender. Page told the magazine he feels relieved to be able to properly express his gender and wants to use his platform to advocate for trans rights. Page first announced his transition on Instagram back in December, for which he received both support and backlash. Page also says he's finding a lot of interest for future film roles. Page is still starring in Netflix's Umbrella Academy, which is currently filming its 3rd season. The show reportedly has no plans to change Page's character Vanya, a role he played pre-transition. Nearly a month ago, extreme weather pushed Texas into a crisis. Now the Lone Star State is rethinking some things, like its energy system. There are also a bunch of investigations looking into the state's preparation and response to the storm. Newsy's Shira Tarlow tells us about one solution being proposed by climate activists: a Green New Deal.
A deadly winter storm plunged much of Texas into a deep freeze that left millions in the state without power and running water, some for several days.
We lost power yesterday morning. Today when we got up, there was no water.
The storm nearly collapsed the state's power grid, impacting all forms of energy production, but hitting the state's reliance on natural gas especially hard. Nearly a month after the crisis, Texas is rethinking its energy system with a flurry of investigations underway into the state's preparation and response to the storm.
We're really seeing in Texas this convergence of the climate crisis that's bringing on more extreme weather events, colliding with kind of disinvestment in our country's infrastructure and power grids.
One solution being floated by climate activists like MULHOLLAND, a Green New Deal, a set of proposals aimed at tackling climate change by transitioning the nation's energy system from coal, oil, natural gas, and nuclear power to 100% clean, renewable energy, while creating millions of jobs and reducing economic inequality along the way.
We gathered our partners in Texas, created mutual aid networks, and also got folks on the ground to tell stories of what a Green New Deal would mean for them in that time of crisis.
We are demanding an overhaul of our broken energy grid to make it 100% renewable.
The sweeping plan is bold and comes with $1 trillion price tag. It faces an uphill battle in Texas, a state dominated by Republican and conservative lawmakers who have long opposed green energy policies and even modest costs to mitigate the threat of climate change. Many Republicans say the plan would lead to job losses in the energy sector, hurt the economy by raising taxes, and ultimately wouldn't make much of a difference without support from China, the world's biggest coal consumer.
This shows how the Green New Deal would be a deadly deal for the United States of America.
For the record, there is no Green New Deal in Texas or anywhere else in the U.S., nor has there ever been. And experts say the outages were largely tied to the state's deregulated energy grid and its lack of winter preparation.
There was also a failure at within the natural gas supply chain as well, to some degree. That's not fully known in terms of freezing components or something, making the stations inoperable, at least for some time period of hours, if not a day.
Texas is the only state in the continental U.S. that mostly relies on its own power grid. About 47% of its energy comes from natural gas, 20% from wind, 20% from coal, 11% from nuclear, and 1% from solar. For now, Texas, and other states for that matter, remain far from passing any version of the Green New Deal, or even using more renewable energy. But activists hope the latest crisis will serve as a catalyst for change.
So I hope that this situation is a learning lesson and builds political momentum for the kind of changes that we need.
Shira Tarlow, Newsy, Washington.
Scammers are using email to target COVID relief checks. The third round of COVID relief checks have started going out to millions of Americans looking for a boost during this pandemic. As if we didn't have enough to worry about already, scammers are taking advantage of this moment, using malware to steal personal banking information and passwords. Newsy's Tyler Atkinson explains.
As millions of Americans await their COVID relief checks, cybercriminals are already taking advantage of the situation to scam people out of their stimulus money. The security company Proofpoint describes one effort where scammers sent out thousands of emails to Americans, asking them to fill out a fake form to apply for stimulus checks from the Internal Revenue Service.
The goal that they have is to send their threat into that inbox and have someone click on it. And they'll do that by any means necessary. Typically, the best way to do that is some kind of social engineering. It'll say something like, oh, in order to see your stimulus check and how to get it, click here, enable these macros, and then a piece of malware will typically infect the machine.
When users open that form, it launches a malicious software called Drydex, which can steal personal banking information and login credentials.
I think there's also going to be investment scams where they're going to target that actual stimulus check, because one of the challenges adversaries had with COVID is with people out of work. But if you now know everyone's going to get a certain amount deposited, that's going to be something that they can easily go after.
Scammers are also using the ongoing pandemic to try to steal from businesses.
We see executives often targeted with things like BEC and email fraud, saying, could you please make a change to the wire transfer? We've had a bank problem because of the lockdowns, or I'm unable to access our normal payment accounts because of coronavirus. And no one questions it.
Experts believe other tax-related scams will become more prominent closer to tax day on April 15th.
We see a significant amount of domains registered that are spoofing as if they're an accountancy, as if they're an agency of the IRS.
The IRS does not communicate with taxpayers via email, period. They make that a known fact.
Tyler Adkisson, Newsy, Chicago.
If you haven't done so already, feel free to reach out to us on Twitter using the hashtag #NewsyInTheLoop. Like, everyone's doing it. At least 9 jurors have been seated so far in the upcoming Derek Chauvin trial, which is set to start later this month. But what are the chances that they'll find him guilty of any of the charges against him? National reporter Usher Qureshi explains the rarity of police prosecutions, even when there's damning video evidence.
Derek Chauvin is charged with second-degree murder, second-degree manslaughter, and third-degree murder. This after he was caught on camera in May kneeling on George Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes.
I think anyone who watches this video and has an even sort of a cursory familiarity with what happened here, I think would have to conclude that this was egregious, unconscionable, and unlawful misconduct.
In the years following the 2014 killing of unarmed teen Michael Brown by Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson, the calls for accountability have grown stronger. Yet it's extremely rare for police officers to face serious legal consequences for using excessive force or even for killing civilians.
It takes a lot of political will to bring prosecutions against members of law enforcement in the first place. And in general, prosecutors are very reluctant to do that.
The Supreme Court also gives police officers a great deal of leeway in their use of force, saying that it must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, rather than with the 20/20 vision of hindsight.
It's one of objective reasonableness. So if their subjective belief is that there was a threat because they're afraid of black men, that's not objectively reasonable.
In Kenosha this past September, protests and riots broke out after police officer Rustin Shesky fired 7 shots into Jacob Blake's back, paralyzing him. No charges were filed.
Many police officers have a fear of black men and black boys, and that is what's driving a lot of what we see.
The 2014 fatal shooting of 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland, says Schweikert, was especially striking. Rice, playing with a realistic-looking pellet gun, was shot dead by an officer just 2 seconds after he arrived on the scene.
I think it's shocking, that case in particular, because as I recall, there wasn't even an attempt to secure criminal charges in that case.
Even when charges are secured, officers are seldomly convicted. Juries and courts are reluctant to second-guess the split-second life-or-death decisions of police officers in potentially dangerous situations. According to a statistical analysis by Bowling Green State University, since 2005, 138 police officers were arrested for shooting and killing someone while on duty. While 44 were convicted of a crime, most were for lesser offenses. Only 7 were convicted of murder.
About 1,000 times each year, an on-duty police officer shoots and kills someone. And it's actually a very rare event that an officer is charged with murder or manslaughter resulting from one of those shootings.
A rare event that will soon begin inside a Minneapolis courtroom. The question, say many, is whether the Chauvin trial results in an exception or a rule. I'm Usher Qureshi reporting.
The pandemic has changed a lot about our lives, including how we access healthcare. As doctors turn toward digital tools for rehabilitation, some patients are being assigned video games. National reporter Maya Rodriguez shows us how they're helping people heal.
Inside this home, what sounds like an old-school video arcade is helping to transform Megan Leaf's life.
It was just a great way to move and to get things going.
Nearly 3 years ago, when she was 37, Megan suffered a stroke, affecting the entire right side of her body, her balance, and ability to speak.
I don't remember anything until I got diagnosed with having a stroke.
Her doctors at Johns Hopkins decided to include something new in her rehabilitation: video games, specially designed for stroke patients.
The advantage of these video games for therapy is that it encourages a patient to do it more often and to participate more often.
Ann SPAR is one of Megan's therapists at Johns Hopkins, where they are now using 20 of these devices.
We provide exercises, but if we have these video games that we can put into the patient's homes like we have with Megan, it helps them want to engage more and be more active.
The video games are known as digital neurorehabilitation therapies, a form of therapy presented in a more engaging way.
New era of digital therapeutics, sort of software-based approaches to treat medical conditions.
Johns Hopkins professor Dr. John KRAKAUER is chief scientific advisor to MINDMAZE, the company behind the games known as Mind Motion Go. He said the pandemic accelerated the use of these programs and will likely spread into more hospitals.
So it has the taste of the future. All the trends are for patients to feel more empowered, to have more continuous contact with their clinicians, even between visits. The digital era is coming. So I think it's like almost like a perfect storm that was catalyzed by COVID-19, obviously, but I don't think it was coming anyway.
Back at her home,
Sometimes it has a result.
Megan Leaf is working to beat her high score.
My goal eventually is to have as much use of my right side back as I can have.
And regain a greater sense of independence. In Bel Air, Maryland, I'm Maya Rodriguez.
That's it for us, gang. As always, thanks for watching. We'll be back tomorrow for more In the Loop. Same time, same place. Top stories from Newsy are headed your way right now.